They never imagined it would end like this. For years, Mark had believed that the house was as good as his. He never questioned it, never asked for paperwork, never thought to check whose name was actually on the deed. To him, it was simply home, the place where he grew up, where his parents still paid the property taxes, fixed the roof when it leaked, replaced the old furnace when winter got harsh. They never asked him for rent. They never reminded him of the cost. They never made him feel like a tenant. That was their first mistake. When Mark brought Lena home for the first time, his parents tried their best. They welcomed her with warm meals, polite questions, and genuine curiosity. Lena was different, confident, outspoken, always quick to point out what she didn't like. The curtains were outdated, the couch looked cheap, the kitchen tiles reminded her of old people's houses. Mark laughed it off, embarrassed but unwilling to correct her. He was in love, and love made him quiet when he should have spoken. Then Lena's parents came. At first, it was only supposed to be temporary. Just until the wedding, Lena said. It'll help us save money. Mark didn't even ask his parents before agreeing. He just assumed they'd be fine with it. After all, they'd always been fine with everything. Boxes appeared in the hallway, suitcases stacked against the walls. The guest room filled up, then the basement, then half the garage. Lena's mother began rearranging the kitchen without asking. Lena's father complained about the thermostat and adjusted it whenever he pleased. Slowly, subtly, the house stopped feeling like Mark's childhood home and started feeling like someone else's territory. Still, his parents said nothing. They noticed how family dinners stopped including them, how conversations lowered when they entered the room, how wedding plans were discussed in front of them but never with them. They were no longer participants, just background furniture in a house they owned. The first real sting came with the invitations, or rather, the lack of one. Mark's mother heard about the wedding date from a neighbor. Someone congratulated her at the grocery store and asked if she was excited for the big day. She smiled, confused, and said she was. That night, she asked Mark directly, "When is the wedding?" Mark hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "Oh, it's in October, small ceremony." "Where?" his father asked. Another pause. "That's still being finalized." The truth came out a week later, accidentally, the way betrayals often do. Lena's sister posted the seating chart online. Every relative, every friend, every distant cousin was listed, except two names: Mark's parents. When confronted, Lena didn't apologize. She didn't even look uncomfortable. "We decided to keep it intimate. No offense, but you're not really our kind of people. My family has a certain standard." Mark stood there, silent. That silence was louder than any insult. His mother felt something break inside her, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a thread snapping after being pulled too tight for too long. His father didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded once and said, "I see." They didn't argue that night. They didn't threaten. They didn't demand an explanation. They went to bed in the room they'd slept in for 30 years and lay awake listening to the laughter downstairs, the clinking of glasses, the sound of people who felt entirely entitled to what wasn't theirs. 2 days later, they returned to the house with documents. Lena's family was in the living room when the parents walked in. Wedding magazines were spread across the coffee table. Lena's mother looked up first. "Oh," she said sharply, "can you give us some privacy? We're in the middle of planning." Mark's father looked around the room slowly, taking it all in. "No," he said calmly, "we won't." Lena's father stood up. "This is our house now. You don't get to just walk in and interrupt us." That's when Mark's mother spoke. "No," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This is our house, and it always has been." Laughter followed, mocking, dismissive laughter. "You don't own this place. Mark does." Mark's father placed the folder on the table and opened it. Title deed, mortgage statements, property tax records, all in our names. The room went silent. Mark's face drained of color. "What?" he whispered. The apartment they moved into was nothing like the house. It was smaller, darker, and louder. The walls were thin enough that arguments from neighboring units leaked through at night, blending with the hum of traffic and sirens. The carpet smelled faintly of old smoke no matter how much Lena scrubbed it. The kitchen barely had counter space, and the bathroom door didn't close properly unless you lifted it slightly and pushed. Mark noticed all of it immediately. Lena noticed it too, but she talked about it differently. To her, this place wasn't a consequence. It was a temporary inconvenience, something unfair that had been done to her. She complained about the lighting, the noise, the lack of storage. She complained about how her parents were upset, how embarrassed she felt explaining to relatives why the wedding was on pause. What she didn't complain about was how it happened. Mark started waking up earlier than usual. He'd sit at the tiny kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't really want, staring at the wall while the sun crept through the blinds. For the first time, there was no house settling around him, no familiar creak of the floorboards, no quiet sense of permanence. Everything felt temporary now, unstable. One morning, he checked his phone and saw a notification from a real estate website. The house had sold. Not just listed, sold. He stared at the screen for a long time before locking his phone and setting it face down on the table. Something about that finality hit harder than he expected. Even after being told to leave, some part of him had believed the house would always be there, like his parents would change their minds, like time itself would soften the edges. It hadn't. Lena noticed his mood shift. "Why are you acting like someone died?" she asked one night as they ate takeout from cardboard containers on the couch. "It's just done," he said quietly. "The house is gone." She rolled her eyes. "So we'll get something better, bigger, eventually." "With what money?" he asked before he could stop himself. The room went quiet. Lena's expression hardened. "Why are you talking like that?" "Because it matters," Mark said. "I never paid rent. I never saved for a down payment. I thought I had time." "You did have time," she snapped. "Your parents took it away." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time he noticed how easily she said that, how naturally blame came to her. Not once had she mentioned the words she'd used. Not once had she questioned whether excluding his parents might have crossed a line. "They didn't take it away," he said slowly. "They owned it." "That doesn't mean they had to do this," Lena replied. "Family doesn't do this." Mark didn't answer, because deep down he knew family also didn't do what they had done. Days turned into weeks. The wedding was officially canceled, though neither of them said the words out loud. Invitations were never sent, deposits quietly refunded. Lena's parents stopped calling as often. When they did, the conversations were strained, heavy with disappointment and subtle accusations. Mark's parents, on the other hand, were silent. At first, Mark told himself they needed space. Then he told himself he'd call when things settled. Then weeks passed, and the silence grew heavier than any argument. One evening, unable to stand it anymore, he drove past the old house. The driveway was empty. The porch light was different. The curtains in the living room window had been replaced with something lighter, airier. Someone else lived there now. Someone who had bought it with their own money, who understood its value. Mark sat in his car for a long time before driving away. That night, he dreamed of his childhood bedroom. In the dream, it was exactly as he remembered: posters on the wall, sunlight through the window, the smell of clean laundry. But when he reached for the door, it wouldn't open. No matter how hard he pushed, it stayed shut. He woke up with a tightness in his chest that didn't fade. The breaking point came quietly. Lena was on the phone with her mother, pacing the apartment. Mark could only hear her side of the conversation. "Yes, I know. No, it's not my fault. Well, maybe if his parents weren't so petty. Exactly, that's what I said. Something in him snapped, not explosively, but decisively. When she hung up, he spoke. I'm going to visit my parents. Lena stopped pacing. Time did what it always does. It kept moving, whether Mark felt ready or not. The first few weeks on his own were uncomfortable in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the money, though that part hurt too. Rent left his account every month like clockwork. Utilities arrived with numbers that no longer felt abstract. Groceries became a calculation instead of a habit. For the first time, he noticed how quickly small expenses piled up when no one else was quietly absorbing them in the background. But the harder part was the silence. No Lena pacing on the phone, no constant noise from other people's expectations, no pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Just him, his thoughts, and the steady realization of how much he had allowed his life to be built on assumptions. He started calling his parents every Sunday. At first, the calls were polite and careful. Updates about work, casual remarks about the weather, safe territory. But gradually, the conversations deepened. His mother talked about things she'd once brushed aside, how hurt she'd been by the wedding exclusion, how humiliating it felt to be dismissed in her own home. His father spoke about disappointment, not anger, which somehow stung more. We didn't raise you to forget where you came from, his father said once, not accusing, just stating a truth. Mark didn't argue. He didn't need to anymore. Meanwhile, news from Lena reached him indirectly. Mutual friends mentioned that she'd moved back in with her parents, that the wedding, once loudly planned and publicly celebrated, was now rarely mentioned, that some of her relatives quietly questioned how things had been handled, though no one said it directly to her. Mark didn't feel triumphant hearing any of it. He felt sober. One evening, months later, he received a message from an unfamiliar number. It was Lena. I saw your parents at the grocery store today, the text read. They didn't even look at me. He stared at the screen for a long time before replying. They don't owe you anything. The response came quickly. Neither do you, apparently. Mark typed, erased, and retyped before finally sending. I owed them respect. I forgot that. I'm not forgetting it again. There was no reply after that. Spring came quietly. Trees outside his apartment window filled in with green. Neighbors began leaving their windows open. The world softened, even if the past hadn't. Mark started picking up extra shifts. He opened a savings account and actually used it. It felt slow, painfully slow, but real. Every small step carried weight because it was his step. One Saturday, his parents invited him over for dinner. Not a holiday, not an apology dinner, just dinner. His mother cooked his favorite meal without announcing it. His father poured iced tea and sat across from him at the table, asking about his plans, his goals, what he wanted his life to look like 5 years from now. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I want it to be something I build, not something I assume. His father nodded. That's a good place to start. After dinner, Mark helped wash the dishes. It felt strangely meaningful. Something so ordinary now carried intention. When he dried his hands and turned around, he noticed a framed photo on the counter. It was the old house, the one that had been sold. He hesitated. Why do you still have that? His mother smiled faintly. Because it reminds us of what we learned too. What did you learn? He asked. That loving someone doesn't mean protecting them from consequences. We should have drawn lines sooner. We thought we were helping. That stayed with him, because for so long he believed consequences were punishments, cruel, unnecessary acts. Now he understood they were corrections, course adjustments, boundaries drawn not out of spite, but clarity. A year passed. Mark's life didn't transform into something glamorous. There was no sudden promotion, no dramatic redemption arc, just consistency, reliability, growth that happened quietly enough that one day he looked around and realized he wasn't the same person anymore. He paid his bills on time, he cooked most of his meals, he asked questions before making assumptions. When he started dating again, he paid attention to how people treated others, waiters, strangers, his own family. When a woman he dated casually, he didn't realize the lesson was complete until the day it stopped hurting to remember. Years later, Mark stood in the driveway of his parents' home, helping his father fix a loose fence post. The sun was low, the air warm, and everything felt ordinary in the best possible way. There was no tension between them now, no unspoken resentment lingering under the surface. Just familiarity rebuilt on honesty instead of entitlement. His life wasn't extravagant. He lived within his means, saved steadily, and valued stability over appearances. The idea of being above anyone no longer impressed him. He had learned the hard way that respect wasn't about status or money. It was about how you treated people when you thought you had power over them. Occasionally, someone would mention the old story, the canceled wedding, the eviction, the house that was never his. When they did, Mark didn't defend himself or justify what happened. He simply said, "I was wrong," and left it at that. Because he was. The house his parents sold became a quiet symbol in his life, not of loss, but of clarity. It reminded him that generosity is not ownership, that love does not erase boundaries, and that gratitude isn't something you feel silently. It's something you show. His parents never asked for recognition. They never demanded apologies or repayment. What they wanted, what they had always wanted, was respect. And in the end, they received it. As Mark watched his father straighten up from the fence and smile with quiet satisfaction, he understood that some lessons only arrive when kindness finally says no. And once it does, there's no going back, only forward, wiser than before.